And we're back. We just went through a video kind of highlighting what logical switching is, why it's important, all that kind of stuff. Now we're going to talk about how we configure segments in NSX. We're going to look at the NSX UI. We're going to look at the policy UI in particular, and we're going to talk about what happens when we build segments and all kinds of stuff there. Now, when we configure a segment, really to create the segment, step one is really all we have to do. We go in and configure the segment. But we probably want to make sure that, well, that things are useful, that the segment actually works. So we need to attach a virtual machine to that segment. We need to make sure that that virtual machine can communicate with other virtual machines. Maybe we validate the port status in NSX. We will see all of this process throughout this video. So creating a segment is pretty straightforward. In the networking tab, we just go into the segments UI. Segments is over on the left-hand side in the navigation menu. And we hit the button that says add a segment. When we add a segment, we see that there's a number of fields. There are a number of fields that need to be filled out. Highlighted are a couple of them that we will probably fill out: the name of the segment, whether or not it's attached to a gateway. Right now, we're not going to worry about any gateway connectivity. We don't have any gateways. We'll talk about that after we get into logical routing in another series of videos coming up. What transport zone the segment is going to belong to. So the transport zone is going to define, again, whether we're looking at a VLAN segment or an overlay segment. Now, we may also include a subnet definition. This is going to be the IP address and CIDR mask of the gateway IP address that ultimately will be created, right? Remember, segments are a desired state, right? This is a policy object, and it's going to describe the desired state of this logical layer 2 domain, which means that we need to have a layer 2 domain, and for it to be really particularly useful, we're going to have a gateway, and that gateway is going to have an IP address. We can look through the rest of this UI here. We could create a DHCP configuration if we need a DHCP server. We could attach this segment to a layer 2 VPN if we have that necessity, and so on, right? There's a number of desired results or desired states that we could configure this segment to work with. At this point, we just want to get the segment created. So we really only need the segment name and the transport zone, right? Those are the things we absolutely need. The gateway connectivity and the subnet, those are useful, but they'll be useful later on. So we create those, we save this, and let's talk about what's going to happen when we hit that save button. All right, when we hit that save button, that desired state configuration is going to go through the policy engine in the NSX Manager. And it's going to say, I want a segment, and it needs to have all these desired state characteristics, right? This transport zone, this gateway, this subnet, and so on and so forth. And Manager is going to take that and break that up into constituent pieces. We need to create this logical switch. We should create a router port on this logical router, and that logical router port should have this logical router IP address, and so on and so forth, right? It's going to break that down into all of the constituent pieces that need to come together to create that segment. It's going to take those individual configuration pieces and hand those to the central control plane. The central control plane will then work to program the data plane, right? The ESXi hosts are my data plane. So the central control plane is going to send configuration payloads to those by way of a process we call the Appliance Proxy Hub, or the APH. This is a service that runs on the NSX Manager that's going to deal with all of the manager and control plane communications to all the different hypervisors. So in this case, we're going to send a payload from the Appliance Proxy Hub across the control plane channel. Remember, that's using TCP port 1235. We're going to send to the transport nodes, the hypervisors, where we want this configured. And that's going to be received by a process called NSX proxy on the hypervisor. This is my local control plane. once NSX proxy receives that payload, then it's going to program the NSXT VDL2 kernel module with the logical switch characteristics and the configurations that we need there. Once we've done that, we can see the segment, so we can see it in the NSX UI. That's what we're looking at on the top screenshot. And we can also see the segment in vCenter, right? That's what we're seeing in the bottom screenshot. And the NSX segment is going to be exposed to vCenter as an NSX port group on my distributed switch. We want to do that because that's how we're going to consume this segment. That's how we're going to attach virtual machines to this segment. And we attach a virtual machine to the segment simply by editing the virtual machine hardware and changing the network adapter configuration. So we just choose from the drop-down menu the browse option, and then we find the segment name in question, select that, and save the virtual machine config, just like we were attaching this virtual machine to any other port group. Now, once we do that, what's going to happen? Well, there are a few things that have to happen here, right? vCenter server is going to send a configuration payload to the ESXi host to say, I want you to connect this virtual machine or the virtual NIC on this virtual machine to a virtual switch port, right? To a port group. Well, at this point, the ESXi host is going to send that request, send that connectivity request to NSX Manager, right? So NSX Proxy will take that and send over the TCP1234 communication channel to the Appliance Proxy Hub to NSX Manager with a request that says, I need to attach this virtual NIC to a segment port. So the manager is going to associate a virtual interface UUID, right? That's the virtual NIC UUID. So the virtual interface is the virtual NIC on the virtual machine. It's going to associate the virtual interface UUID with a logical interface UUID, right? The logical interface is the segment port identifier. So we're going to associate that virtual interface with a logical interface. We're going to save that configuration, right? That's going to be persisted to the Corfu database on the NSX Manager so that all the other managers get to know about it as well. And then we have to tell the transport node, the ESXi host, about that configuration. Well, Manager doesn't do that directly. Manager sends that data to the central control plane. The central control plane, again, through the Appliance Proxy Hub, sends that configuration back to NSX Proxy on the ESXi host, and NSX Proxy tells the ESXi host how to interconnect that virtual NIC with the segment port, and then everything's done. Now, I can look at the segment port status in NSX. I can open up NSX, I can go into my segment, and I have a segment ports column in the UI. Well, that's going to be some number of segment ports if I have virtual machines attached. So I can click on that number, and that's going to bring up the set segment ports UI, where I can see the segment ports, the virtual machines that are attached, and I can see the status, right? If the status is success, well, that means that the configuration has been programmed into the data plane and my segment port should be connected just fine. At this point, I can take these two virtual machines connected to this segment, and I should be able to test connectivity and ping from one to the other, right? Connectivity should work. Now I can also see this configuration. I can visualize this configuration by going to the network topology navigation entry in the segments UI. And that gives me a visual representation of what's going on in my infrastructure. So we'll show you the virtual machines that are attached to segments. We'll show all the different segments, and every object in the topology is clickable. I can drill into that and get some more information right here in the network topology UI. And then from the network topology, from the configuration information dialog that pops up, I could drill into that object specifically and jump in to different parts of my NSX UI. This visualization is incredibly valuable because what's a better way to figure out what my network is doing than to simply visualize it, to simply see it. So here we can drill in, we can see the selection of an object here. We've chosen a segment. We've clicked on a segment called web segment, and we can see some configuration detail about that. And you can see down at the bottom of that panel on the right how we can jump into the segment configuration directly. So that's how we configure a segment and what happens underneath the hood when we configure that segment, right? What talks to what and how all this process happens. So it's a pretty straightforward process, I think, but maybe it's just because I've got a little more practice studying it. You can kind of look at this. If you need to review the video, great, go ahead and do that. But here we've talked about configuring segments. Here in the next video coming up, we're going to talk about segment profiles. So how do we control all of the different traffic patterns and types of traffic that maybe are going across a segment? How do we configure these segment ports and so on? So that's coming up in the next video. We'll see you there.